Well, young economists, this is the loanable funds market, and there's some things I want to point out about how you'll draw it. First thing to notice is the loanable funds market looks at the real interest rate. And this has already been adjusted for inflation. It's not nominal, it's not in the here and now. So real interest is adjusted for the rate of inflation. It's a simple supply and demand graph, except this time supply is labeled SLF for supply of loanable funds. Demand is still down, labeled DLF, demand of loanable funds. Notice the horizontal axis, Q of LF, quantity of loanable funds, and your initial equilibrium point, I for the interest rate, and QLF for the quantity of loanable funds. Now in the loanable funds market, demand can shift, supply can shift. It all depends on what the government is doing with its fiscal policy. For example, let's say you have a government that is operating a deficit. Where do they get their money to operate in a deficit? Well, they have to borrow it. The place they borrow it is the same place the rest of us do. So there are two things that could possibly happen if the government is deficit spending. The government has deep pockets and deep needs. If they create a demand on loanable funds because they are deficit spending, the demand of loanable funds curve, if I can draw it correctly, is going to shift to the right as demand increases. You could simply go in here and draw your shift in demand to the right, and that's all well and good. But there are a couple of other things that might happen as well when we do this. Not only are they demanding more loanable funds, but they are also sucking up loanable funds when they do this. So it's perfectly okay in this graph to say, well, if the government is deficit spending, the supply of loanable funds is going to shift to the left, interest rates are going to go up. And you should be familiar by now with a term called crowding out, that when the government is borrowing all kinds of money like this, interest rates will increase, and it's going to make it harder for you and I to get loans because interest rates go up. We might not want to take a high interest rate loan, we'll just kind of hold off on it. So the loanable funds market is a market in which you and I and the government all have to compete for the same level of funds. And what you're going to have to decide as you manipulate these graphs is, what do you want to shift? Do you want to shift demand? Do you want to shift supply? You can have correct answers both ways. You just have to pay attention to the way the questions are being asked. The key is, when the government is in deficit, they're either going to be increasing demand, raising interest rates, or they're going to be decreasing the supply, also increasing interest rates. If the economy is balanced and they're not borrowing any money whatsoever, there still may be some subtle effects, but normally this graph is reserved for when the government is in deficit.